Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom. Giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teachings of this truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aqua. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to talk about, how ancient culture, sex and marriage were very, very different from how it's seen today. In today's time, sex is pretty much seen as something that is more recreational. It is seen something as a strictly just pleasure. And yes, there is a sentiment of pleasure to it, but there was a bit more in the ancient times. There was more responsibility tied to it. It wasn't something as you see here, in this kingdom where basically the pleasure is skyrocketed and the responsibility basically has declined, right? Because a lot of our women have eaten of that fruit, of the basically the serpent, taking in these different philosophies. So for example, you have a lot of feminism, and these are belief systems that has basically contaminated the minds, of our women and our people as a whole, to the point where you don't adhere to the ancient way and you don't adhere to the ways of the Lord, right? So now you see is there's a broken up of families. There's no longer a coming together of families. And when you don't have families, you don't have a strong clan and a strong nation, right? So this is what Esau has done very, very meticulously by breaking up, the family structure and basically pitting the women, against the men, right? And that's one of the things the Lord hates. One of the things the Lord hates is, an enemy that sows discord, right? I didn't have that, but let me start with that, and then I'm gonna get to my really the main point I kind of want to hit, with this lesson. This is something that's kind of just been on my mind in regards to sex and marriage and responsibility, right? Let me go here. This is Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16 here. And it says, "These 6 things doth the Lord Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai hate. 7 are an abomination unto him: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, and false witness that speaketh lies, and in he that soweth discord among brethren," right? So basically we've had a lot of discord, amongst, our men and, and our women as well, because, we're supposed to actually come together to become one flesh and actually basically to be able to be fruitful, and multiply, right? But now we understand, us as the hopeful elect, we understand the importance of the ancient way. We understand why the Heavenly Father's ways are truly higher than the ways of this world. And the scriptures talk about how the ways of this world is foolish, because when you look at the dating scene and when you look at the culture, Babylonian culture, it's not leading towards coming together. It's basically just more division and more separation, right? And that's one of the things, the Lord is bringing division, right? But you understand the importance. We understand the importance of cohesion, right? Being in tune with Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai, right? So I kind of wanted to start off here. This is just something that's been on my mind. I was just thinking about, and I kind of just thought I would read a couple, precepts on this. This is Deuteronomy 22, verse 28. And it says here, if a man, I'm reading the KJV first, and it says, if a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, and lay hold on her, and lie with her, and they be found, then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. And because he hath humbled her, he may not put her away all his days. Right? So I'm reading in the AMP here, in the Amplified, and it says, if a man finds a girl who is a virgin, who is not engaged, and seizes her, and is intimate with her, and they are discovered, then the man who was intimate with her shall give 50 shekels to the girl's father, and shall become his wife, because he has violated her, and he can never divorce her. Right? So in this situation, if a man actually laid with a woman, right, and this is something that is a possibility. It could have happened in the ancient times, but it wasn't something that was just like running like rampant, right? Because there was a responsibility tied to it, because you couldn't just like I'll say it like this: in this culture, you have you dine and you dash, if that makes sense. I kind of say it in very colloquial terms, right? Man lays down with a woman, and then and it's kind of like a one night stand, and then that's it, right? In this culture, that's how it is, right? But that's not proper. That's not healthy. That's not correct, because the purpose of sex is really to actually become one flesh, and to be able to bring forth seed, and bring forth children, right? So a lot of times in this culture, what happens is the men are not fully developed in terms of having wisdom and finances, right? And they might lay with a woman, right? And because they're not properly developed, then there is a whole skewing up of responsibility, because there is the fact that a woman can become pregnant, and a child can come out of that relationship, so to speak, right? This is how it is in this culture. In the ancient times, lessons I read here, when a man did so, and he laid with a woman, he had to pay the father the 50 shekels of silver. So what does that mean? The man had to have some kind of substance. He had to be established. He couldn't just, be multiplying wives like that, right? Because, there was a responsibility tied to having a woman, or having a wife, so to speak, and or even if a man had more than one, people talk about like I'll just use King Solomon as an example, right? King Solomon had multiple wives, right? But he was a king. He had resources, he had substance, but most importantly, really and truly, what he had and he prayed for, when you read in the 3rd chapter of Kings, he had wisdom. That's really the most important thing to actually to take in, because a lot of our people might hear about the story of King Solomon, and they try to basically multiply wives to their situation when they don't have enough experience, or they actually haven't properly developed or addressed certain things about themselves to actually be able to manage that responsibility. You know what I'm saying? So basically, as the scriptures say, they might be let me read it. What's that? Ecclesiastes 7. This is Ecclesiastes 7:16, and it says, "And be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself?" In the AMP, it says, do not be excessively righteous, like those given to self-conceit, and do not be overly wise or pretentious, right? So pretentious is kind of like a fancy word, for someone who's showy. right? Why should you bring yourself to ruin? Because that's something that can bring you to your ruin for a lot of men. And a good example of that is the whole situation with what's this guy's name? I think in Genesis, Hakai, if I'm not mistaken, his name was, right? In that kind of situation, it's much better, as Paul said, it is I wish that all men were even as I myself, right? Because he was just focused. He didn't deal with women like that. But not to go too off topic, I just wanted to bring out, certain factors that play out within this society. And in those factors, like for example, I kind of wanted to just touch on the men, going back to the 50 shekels thing. In the ancient times, the man had to be more established. So most likely he was a lot older. He acquired more substance. He had more time to acquire more substance, right? He had to put in his, put in his, as they say in the world, they pull up your bootstraps or something like that. He had to basically work, right? And then he'd be able to afford, and take on a responsibility of having a woman, having a wife, right? So that's really the point I wanted to touch on, because it shows that in paying that money, you're removing your father's employee out of the household, right? But you have to compensate the father, right? So there was a strong adherence to culture. And that is one of the main things that our people strongly lack, is culture. Because you don't have fathers, and the fathers are taken out of the household, you don't have a male authority to be able to vet who is being given to your daughters. So your daughters basically don't see a template of how a man is supposed to be, a righteous man who follows the ways of Yahweh Bashim El Shai. And because she doesn't get that righteous template, that example, she finds, and because of the society we live in too, there is much liberty, right? Let me read something in Isaiah. Isaiah 55 verse 8, and it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord Yahweh. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Because the ways of the Lord are above the ways of this world. Because going back into what I just read earlier, right? In an example, if a man just took a woman, he raped her, he couldn't just put her away, right? These were ancient customs, and this is what happens if a man did so. He had to pay the 50 shekels of silver, right? So that was a hefty price, right? And he had to, he couldn't put her away. So what happens? I'm reading this precept to show that, in the event that did happen, okay, the woman, she has a husband to take care of her, and the what's it called, the man has his wife, and the child that comes forth from that union, that child has both of their parents, which is a much better way than the ways of this world. Because what happens in this world is that it promotes contraception, which is basically contra is against, inception goes back to basically giving birth, right? So it's basically, you have products that are being pushed forth to increase the pleasure, the freedom of constantly just having sex, and the responsibility is basically dwindled. It's not about responsibility anymore, because, in the ancient times, it was the two were basically strongly paired together, right? It wasn't one, without the other, right? So, let me read this. Let me go here. As a matter of fact, let me go to Jeremiah, then I'll get an account real quick. This is Jeremiah 6:16, and it says, "Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, stand ye in the ways and see and ask for the old paths, and where is the good way, and walk therein. And ye shall find rest for your souls." And they said, "We will not walk therein." So these are the ancient ways of how things were, right? Now, I want to get another quick precept, for people who might be more simple-minded, right? Um, you know, Paul said, all things are lawful. One second. Right? Because we're discussing ancient customs of how things were, right? This is not a light a green light to basically go ahead and do this. I should have actually opened up with this precept. This is 1 Corinthians 6 verse 12, and it says, all things are lawful unto me, but not all things are expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of I will not be brought under the power of any. Okay, let's see what that word for expedient. So the Greek word here is symphoro, and it means to collect or contribute in order to help, to be profitable, to be expedient. Okay, let's get an understanding of what expedient actually means. Just bear with me. Let me just Google this. Just for edification. So expedient describes an action that is practical or useful or effective for achieving a specific goal, often prioritizing immediate results over ethical considerations and long-term consequences or fairness, right? So this is something that is not practical to be doing in this time, right? That's really the point here, right? We're basically discussing the importance of ancient customs and how things were handled in the event these things happened, right? This is not a green light to go ahead and do this, you know what I'm saying? Because, you might be in a specific situation, or, you might be in a specific state where that is actually unlawful according to the ways of, this world, right? I'll say it like that. But, the point is, in the ancient times, it was the mindset was very much different. As a matter of fact, let me get this in Ezra's, right? Because the scriptures really goes into how things were done in the ancient times. So is very important is not to approach the scriptures using a modern day mindset. Let me get Ezra's 1 second. Just bear with me. What's that? Second Ezra's. Second Ezra's 14 verse 34, and it says, "Therefore, if so be that ye will subdue your own understanding and reform your hearts, ye shall be kept alive. After death, ye shall obtain mercy." Right? So subduing your own understanding, it helps to understand these certain concepts of how things were practically done within the ancient times. Like I said before, a lot of these things are not expedient to do, right? But this is how things were managed in the ancient times, because in the ancient times, women were actually groomed to be a helpmate and have more home economical skills and responsibilities to be able to add to that man and add to that house, right? They weren't sent off to college and stuff like that. Like, that's a whole And on top of that, college pushes forth a very Bacchus, revelry, heavily drinking, overly sexual mindset. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't actually promote family. It doesn't promote coming together. The rhetoric is always, I want to go find myself and all this kind of stuff, right? But what you do is, for a lot of you women, you go there and you destroy yourself mentally as well as, physically, right? But the purpose of sex was for you to be able to come together, and become one flesh and actually bring forth children, and that's how families are built, right? We understand now that in this time, it's not, that's not the actual way of how things were. I'm sorry, that's not the way how things are, right? So I wanted to read this. Hold on. I want to read a little bit of this in the book here. So this is the book of Tobit, chapter 8, verse 1. And I'll read down to, I believe it's 6. And it says, "And when they had supped, they brought Tobias in unto her, and as he went, he remembered the words of Raphael and the ashes of the perfumes, and put the heart and the liver of the fish thereupon, and made a smoke wherewith." So basically, just to understand context, there was an evil spirit dwelling, plaguing Sarah, right, in this story, right? And Tobias basically is the son of Tobit, and basically she was going through her own suffering, right? So they got up, there's a fish that they caught, Tobias and Raphael here. I think his name was also Azarias, if I'm not mistaken, right? And it was helped to basically cure that evil spirit that was plaguing her, right? But this is verse 3, and it says, "The which smell when the evil spirit had smelled, and he fled into the utmost parts of Egypt, and the angel bound him. And after that they were both shut in together. Tobias arose out of the bed and said, Sister, arise, let us pray that the Most High Yahweh Bashem Shai would have pity on us. Then they began, Tobias to say, Blessed art thou, O power Yahweh Bashem Shai of our fathers, and blessed is thy holy and glorious name forever. Let the heavens bless thee and all the creatures." Here's the point. Oh, sorry, it's verse 7 is the point. It says, "Thou madest Adam and gavest him Eve, his wife, for an helper and a stay. For of them came mankind, and thou hast said, It is not good that man should be alone. Let us make him an aid like unto himself," right? So it shows you that, it was a lot more, that they came with, and they were basically cultivated with when it comes to actually bringing forth, coming together in one flesh and bringing forth children, right? The women weren't just, it wasn't just strictly just for pleasure. Right here it says, verse 6, continuing on. Sorry, this is verse 7. It says, "O Lord, I take this my sister for," hold on, I think there is an error here. Give me 1 second. Let me just get this. Okay, I knew there was an error. Okay, so it says here, Tobit 8, verse 7, and it says, "And now, O Lord, I take not this, my sister, for lust, but uprightly. Therefore, mercifully ordain that we may become aged together," right? So there was an importance of them coming together and there was essentially a you know, there was responsibilities, you know. It wasn't just strictly, just about, enjoying, the pleasures of sex and sex only, right? It was actually to actually bring forth, and, the joining together of families. You might have had inheritance, responsibilities were laid out, you know what I'm saying? So, it was a lot more, um, it was a lot more, duties, responsibilities, in the ancient times when it came to, this union, right? It wasn't strictly just for pleasure and how we see this. It's just that within this society as a whole, you're constantly bombarded by pleasure, whether it's on social media, Instagram, TV, or even just going outside. It's summertime, right? So you're constantly bombarded by it, right? And we don't actually, people don't have that mindset of that responsibility aspect anymore. It's really just about, now, right? I think in the scriptures it talks about in the last days people shall be lovers of themselves, right? So that's the mindset, people have, where, when it comes to the ideas of marriage and, coming together with a wife and having children and so on and so forth, there's a bit more of a servitude mindset. So basically, more of a denying yourself to be able to care for, the wife, and making sure your children are trained up in the proper way, I should say. Excuse me, right? So, I wanted to read that. I just thought, this was a This is a very, very interesting topic, because you see the sharp contrast between how it is now versus how things were done in the ancient times. And this is why, we seek for new heavens and a new earth. As a matter of fact, I'll end off with that, because in this world, it doesn't actually bring forth the ways of this world. It's not bringing forth, life. Things are dying, things are becoming weaker through age. What is that? Second, is it 3? And nevertheless, 2 Peter 3 verse 13, it says, nevertheless, according to his promise, look for new heavens and new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness, right? So these things, this is what, the world strongly needs, right? Because, people are not even having children like that anymore. People are not even getting married. I spoke to somebody recently last week, and he normally does photography for weddings. And he was telling me, like, people don't even, people are getting, when the turnout for weddings, it went from like, he was said like about 200 down to like, 70, 80 people max, right? So, people, it's expensive, it's costly, right? People, this is what happens when you don't follow the righteous way. This is, so anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but, Lord's will, this lesson was just quick, edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.